Okay. Yep, we're good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for doing this for us. We started talking about this, I guess, sometime this winter, and Ben is an authority on Robert's Rules, so I am so excited to have him sharing his wisdom with us today. And for all the Junior League members that are tuning in, look for an email coming from me and Lane shortly. We have an additional goodie for you guys. So, Lane, do you have anything else you want to add?
I just wanted to say thank you again as well to Ben for hosting this for us, and for Carol for working with the Education and Development Committee to kind of jointly host this as well from Education and Development and the Community Board Bank. I'm excited that there was so much interest, not only from League members and Together SC partners, but also some of the JLC grant recipients were extended the invitation and joined hopefully as well. So Lee Patterson coordinated that through the League. So we're happy to have such a good crowd, and look forward to learning a lot from you. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. I do, from Together SC, want to give the Junior League of Columbia our thanks for bringing this topic to our attention. Robert's Rules of Order is something I'm pretty passionate about. Well, really, I'm passionate about good meeting procedure. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So what we're going to be talking about is what Robert's Rules of Order actually say, because what I have found in my experience is that I get into meetings with folks, formal meetings, business meetings, and we get into this sort of battle of the wills over who thinks they know Robert's Rules better. And what I find oftentimes is that nobody's actually read them, right? And we're all just sort of interpreting what we think it is. And so what I want to talk about today is what's actually in the rule books. Before we get onto that, though, I want to do a quick poll with y'all here to just ask those of you who are on what your role in your organization is. So I've popped up a little poll question here. Hopefully it showed up on your screen. The question is, what's your role in your organization? Are you an officer of your board? Are you just a regular old board member? Are you an executive director of your organization, so the lead staff member? Or are you some other kind of volunteer? I'm getting folks answering in now, and I'm seeing pretty evenly. We've got some board officers, board members, volunteers, and executive directors. So it's pretty even on the number of folks in what your role is in your organization. So that's pretty cool. I'll just share that with you right there for a second. So we've got, about a third of attendees are executive directors or staff of their organizations. About another third, just less than another third, are volunteers and other board members and board officers. So, what I'll say, and I'll say it several times throughout, is that the person who needs to know Robert's Rules the most is the person leading the meeting. So that's going to end up being the board chair or the committee chair in most cases. And it is up to that person to know these rules inside and out. But that's kind of hard to do, and I'll talk with you about why that is. So what we're going to cover today is why the rules of order are important and why they should be used and interpreted correctly. We're going to talk about how a deliberative body uses a meeting to conduct business. And I've bolded and underlined these words deliberately because they have a very specific meaning in the rules of order. We're going to talk about how motions are made and considered, how discussions are conducted, how motions can be amended in the process of discussing business, and how questions can be postponed or referred to a committee, and how a deliberative body can change its mind at different times. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how this new virtual meeting world can make meetings worse or better, depending on how you use them. So just a little bit about me. Carol said that I'm an authority on Robert's Rules of Order. I would dispute that a little bit. I'm just a fanboy. I'm a big fan of Robert's Rules. I have learned about meeting procedure often in my time, and I advocate for good use of the rules, but I am not a registered parliamentarian. That is a specific I'm sorry. That's a specific certification that I don't have yet, although I'm sure I'll go and get it one day, but it requires taking a test, and life is busy. But so take what I'm saying as the advice of someone who's well used to the rules and has used them before, but I'm just like y'all. I've been in a number of meetings and have kind of figured it out and read the rules as I've gone on. Together SC, the organization I represent, is the State Association of Charitable Nonprofits and Philanthropic Organizations. We have 800 members all across the state. We were originally the South Carolina Association of Nonprofit Organizations, and so we've been around since 1996, and we are your resource for all things nonprofits. I'm seeing some questions come in. And I do want to say, yes, we will be sharing the presentation and the slides after this meeting, and we'll share the recording as well. So, lot of ground to cover here, and I'll just give you a little history lesson here. Yes, there was a guy named Robert, but Robert was his last name. Brigadier General Henry M. Robert published the first edition of his Rules of Order in 1876. So that's well over 100 years ago. And I think it basically came about because he, like many of you, ended up in a meeting and it did not go well at all. So he was asked to chair his local church council meeting, and it got really heated. It got out of his control. People got mad and started fighting, and he realized, okay, we've got to have a better way of doing this because this ain't working. And so he studied the rules of procedure for Congress, and he studied the rules of procedure for the United Kingdom Parliament, and came up with his set of rules of order. Back in those days, in the 1800s, there weren't many professional nonprofit organizations. That didn't really start to happen until the 40s and 50s. So a lot of charitable organizations, a lot of other nonprofit organizations were voluntary societies that were organized by well-meaning people who were doing this work on a volunteer basis. And of course, what that meant was a lot of those people, a lot of the volunteers had to have a say in what was going on, right? The Junior League is an excellent example of one of those volunteer societies that still exists in this modern day. There are lots of other voluntary societies that still are around, and Robert's Rules of Order was created for them. So that those voluntary societies would have sort of basic rules for conducting their meetings and getting their work done. So it's been published since 1876 and then is currently in its 11th edition. However, I found out last night the 12th edition is scheduled to be released in September of 2020. So the big book is about 770 pages long. And for those of you who can see my screen, this is my copy of it. It's pretty thick. I had a little incident with some coffee where I spilled some coffee and got it all over my book. But it is very small print, spiral bound. It can be used as a doorstop if necessary. And it's accrued all of this content for all of these different scenarios and different ways that things could happen over the last 100 or so years. And General Robert was very passionate about this because his opinion on this, and this quote comes from one of the first pages of the book, is that where there is no law and everyone does what is right in their own eyes, there is the least of real liberty. And I really agree with this. I have been in so many meetings, as I'm sure all of you have, where everybody's just kind of doing what they want to do and saying what they want to say, and they go on and on and on forever, but no decision actually gets made. And that's really frustrating. But it also can be very frustrating when somebody, we have some very young participants on. Just a reminder, folks, if you want to mute your lines, that way we can, everybody can hear. You know, on the other token, it's really difficult if you've got one person in a meeting who is just so very insistent on following the rules of order to the very letter, when everybody else could do with a little bit of leeway. So it's really up to the leader of the meeting, whoever that is, to strike a good balance and make use of the rules of order. So as I said, there's the big book. Currently in the 11th edition, 12th edition's coming out soon. It's very long, very small print, and I don't know that anyone has ever read it from cover to cover. Maybe a handful of people in this world have. But it's a reference book. It's intended to be a reference book. It's not intended that you have read it and know it inside and out. Not even professional registered parliamentarians who have the highest level of certification on rules of order, not even they are expected to have read it cover to cover. They're just expected to know how to use it. And so I would say it's at least a must-have for presiding officers at meetings. Not necessarily to have read, but to know how to read it, to know how to find what you're looking for. The book that I would advise that everybody get is this one. I'm holding it up, but it's also right here on my presentation. Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised in brief. It's a much shorter book. It's less than 200 pages. The print is a little bit bigger. If you're a pretty speedy reader, you can read it cover to cover in one night. And I would recommend that presiding officers do read it cover to cover, at least so that you can get a working knowledge of what's in it. And I think if you're going to be a regular participant in meetings and things like that, you definitely want to have a copy of this. It doesn't replace the big book. It makes references to the big book. It will cite sources from the big book. So it's good to have both copies. I've got both copies here, as you see. But if you just need a basic shakedown in it, the yellow book is a good book to have. And most of what I'm going to be talking about comes from the yellow book, the in brief. So I just see some questions popping in. I want to take a little quick look here. I think we're good. So there's a balance that needs to be struck, and this is what Robert's Rules of Order seeks to accomplish. We want to balance the rights of the individual member with the rights of the deliberative body as a whole. So the individual member has the right to be heard and to participate in a discussion. And the individual member has the right to provide whatever information that they may have that can help the body make a decision. And they have a right to have their questions and their issues be given due consideration by the body. And they have a right not to be sidelined or to have decisions made without a chance for them to give input. So what you'll find is a lot of the rules are in place to prevent a body from running roughshod over an individual member. But you'll also see that there are rules in place to prevent an individual member from holding up the business of the body, because the body as a whole has a right to make its decisions without an inordinate delay or an unnecessary holdup. So, you know, there are rules in place to prevent rehashing decisions that have already been made. That's more difficult to do if the rules are being followed. And the rules are in place to prevent a single member or a small group of members from hijacking discussion. And I think what you'll find in many meetings is that when the discussion gets hijacked, it's because a small group of people are interpreting the rules incorrectly or taking advantage of other people's lack of knowledge about the rules. And that's why I think it's necessary for everyone to have a working knowledge of the rules so that everyone's on the same playing field. So, getting to the brass tacks here. You're going to a meeting. This is going to cover part 2, that's chapters 2 through 7 of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised in brief. So what's going on here? You're going to a meeting and some things are happening. You're participating in a deliberative body, a group that is making decisions. If the group is not going to be making decisions, if it's just a discussion, if it's just some other purpose of meeting other than making decisions, you don't really need to have the rules of order. It's not really that kind of a meeting. So you don't necessarily need to go to all the effort to use the rules if you're not going to be making decisions or conducting formal business. But if you are, this is what the rules of order are for. And so I've seen some bodies where they will have a formal business meeting, they'll handle their business, they'll use the rules of order, and then all other things that are not a part of that formal business meeting are taken care of afterwards. Or vice versa. They'll say, we'll have our programmatic aspect of our meeting first, and once we've done that, then we'll have a formal business meeting at the end to make decisions. But a meeting in this case is a gathering of that body at which decisions are made. So a body has defined members who have rights. And that can be the whole-scale membership of a society or organization. It can be a board of directors who have been elected by the membership of that society, or in the case of many service-providing nonprofits, the board elects itself. Or it can be a committee of that board. No matter what the size of the group is, the rules still apply, though you can scale them down a little bit, depending on how big the body is. But at any meeting, there will be 2 officers. There'll be a presiding officer, who you can call whatever you want to call them, depending on the circumstances. Most of the time you hear them called a chair or president, but some societies have funnier names for them, and that's okay. Usually the bylaws of a society will tell what the presiding officer's title is. But no matter what, their job is to keep the order and to determine who may speak and when, so that everybody's not talking over each other. And the presiding officer's goal, especially in a larger group, is not necessarily that a certain outcome be achieved, but that the body's business is completed fairly and relatively unobstructed. Now, they can allow for a good discussion. They should allow for a healthy debate, but they should be able to sense when the debate has gotten unhelpful or unproductive and be able to step in and rein it back. And then the other officer who's important here is the secretary, because it's their job to take a record of the meeting. And we call that minutes. What minutes are not is a play-by-play or a script or a transcript of a meeting. It's simply a record of the decisions made. And I've seen minutes get really, really long, multi-pages, and then it's hard to find what the decisions were. That's not helpful. Minutes should really only record who was at the meeting, what time the meeting started, and what decisions were made, and what time the meeting ended. That's really all they need to record. You can take other notes for your own needs, but the minutes should only really cover the basic decisions being made. If this is a committee, generally the chair of the committee will fill both roles. They'll preside over the meeting, and they'll also take the minutes and report them out later. So it's important to understand that those 2 basic officers are necessary for a meeting to be conducted. So Oh, I want to go back and give you another poll on this about the presiding officer, because I find that there's some disagreements about the nature of what a chair or a presiding officer can do. So here's a pop quiz for you. Can the chair of a body or the presiding officer of a body vote on a question? This is one this is one of those questions where I get some discussion or debate on. I got into an argument over this with somebody one time. I'm seeing most people are saying yes, some people are saying no. So the it's getting a little even now. Thanks, folks, for your answers. I'm gonna just share what folks thought. So it's about even. What people thought. The answer to this question is yes, actually. The presiding officer of a body can, and under certain circumstances, should vote if they themselves are a member of the body. And in most cases, the presiding officer is a member of the body, right? They don't get to that office because they were never a member before. And so what happens, though, is that most of the time in voice votes, a presiding officer will abstain from voting in order to maintain their impartiality. However, when it comes to a situation where their vote could impact the direction of the final decision, they should absolutely cast their vote. This is not necessarily to say that the chair only votes in a tie. A chair or presiding officer can vote to break a tie or vote to create a tie in certain circumstances. So generally a presiding officer will withhold their vote unless they need to cast it in order to either break a tie or create a tie. And so that's what causes most people to think that a chair can only vote in a tie. If there's a recorded vote being taken place, like a ballot or a roll call, the chair should absolutely cast their vote during that time. But if it's just a regular voice vote, generally a chair will abstain in order to maintain impartiality, I should say. So that's a little fun trick question. It's one that gets debated a lot, so I thought I'd share that with you. So we get into a meeting, and the first thing that a lot of folks want to talk about is, okay, do we have a quorum? Do we have enough people here? We need to have a quorum. Why do we need to have a quorum? A quorum is the minimum number of members needed for the body to conduct decisions. And this goes back to preserving the rights of individual members of the body. We don't want a minority of the members making decisions that impact everybody else. And so there needs to be a majority of members present at the meeting. Now, some bodies may, in their bylaws, have a different definition of what a quorum is. Large societies may say, okay, there's just no way we're going to get all 1,000 of our members in one room, so we'll have a lower threshold for a quorum. We still want it to be a significant number, but we'll have it at least be, what is a large group of our most active people. But in a general sense, if it's not stated anywhere else, a quorum is a simple majority. So I have another poll question for you here, because sometimes I find that people disagree on what a majority is. So I want to ask you, what is a simple majority? Is it 50% plus of the members plus one? Is it 51% of the members? Is it more than half? And you may say to yourself, Ben, this is a trick question. These are all the same thing. Not necessarily, because it depends on how many members there are. And really, the more members there are, the more different these numbers can get. So most of us have voted. Many of you are saying 50% of the members plus one. although more than half is catching up now. Some of you have said 51%. So I'm going to stop the poll here, and I'll share with you. It's about even between 50% plus 1 and more than half. The correct answer is more than half. Under certain circumstances, 50% plus 1 is not, it is actually more than what you need, depending on how many members you have. So if you have an odd number of members, let's say you have 21 people. Well, half of that is, half of 21 is 10.5. Well, you can't have a half person, right? So you have to round up to 11. Well, plus 1 is 12. That's more than you need. So more than half, however, is 10.5, round up to 11. 11 is more than half. That's all you need. So that's where it can get to be splitting hairs a little bit. This is where people might start to roll their eyes. But hey, if you've got 11 people and not 12, it's important. So a simple majority is defined as more than half. So when you get into a meeting, there's generally a standard order of business that a deliberative body will undertake. There will be, first and foremost, the reading and approval of the minutes of the prior meeting. There will be reports from officers and committees. There will be a period of unfinished business and a period of new business. That's the standard order. We'll talk about agendas in just a second. So diving into this a little bit more here, reading and approval of the minutes. Technically, if the minutes have not been distributed beforehand, the secretary is supposed to read them out loud, which is why minutes should not be very long. But it's better to have the minutes crafted, written, and distributed beforehand, because if they've been distributed beforehand, they don't have to be read aloud. And this is another sticking point where people get confused and think, oh, the minutes have to be voted on. And you'll find a lot of deliberative bodies will actually vote on approving the minutes. You don't actually have to vote on approving the minutes. The chair will simply ask, are there any corrections? And people can suggest corrections. If there's a disagreement on the corrections, like if one person says, hey, I think it should say this, and somebody else says, no, I don't think it should say that, then we can have a vote on it. But I've never honestly heard of a fight over the minutes. It may be just me, maybe somebody's experienced that before, but generally the chair will simply ask, are there corrections to the minutes? And people will suggest them, they'll get incorporated. And if nobody else has any, then the chair will declare the minutes approved as they stand. So if you find that the body you're participating in likes to vote on the minutes, it's okay, but just know that they don't have to. It's not really necessary, but some do it anyway. Then with office reports, you may have officers that have to give standing reports. The president, the treasurer may give a financial report. Other officers may give reports. Committee chairs will give reports on behalf of their committees. If there's any business that the committees are reporting back out, then that's discussed at that time and voted on. And then we get into a period of unfinished business. And here's a sticking point where I get fussy with folks. And Robert's Rules of Order now, the way it's been edited, gets fussy with folks. It's not old business. Stop calling it old business. It's not old business, because when you call it old business, this lets people think, oh, this is where I can bring up things we've discussed before and argue it ad nauseum. That is not what this is for. Unfinished business is for business that was talked about at the last meeting that was not disposed of and was carried over to this meeting. So it's not an opportunity to go over everything we've ever talked or reconsider every decision we've ever made ever. If that's being done, the chair really needs to put a stop to that. there should be defined items, and those defined items should only be the things that were postponed at a previous meeting. And then there's a period of new business where new motions and new discussion can be brought before the body. This is the standard order of business. This is what a society should use if they don't have an agenda. But most societies and most deliberative bodies now use an agenda because, hey, the standard order of business may not be enough for us. Maybe we want to have a little bit of our own way of doing things. So an agenda is a commonly used alternative to the standard order. And what an agenda does is it allows, the agenda itself is a motion. It is a motion that the body conduct its business in a certain way. And so usually the chair, along with some other officers, maybe an executive committee, will work together to craft the agenda. And the first item of a deliberative body that uses an agenda should be to adopt that agenda, because only the whole body as a whole can determine what business it will take up. And so if you're going to use an agenda, the very first thing that the chair should do is say, the meeting will come to order. The question is adoption of the agenda. All in favor say aye, opposed no, and the ayes have it. Because once the agenda is adopted, then the agenda should be followed. And no deviation from the agenda should be permitted by the chair after the agenda is adopted and until the agenda is completed. So if somebody says, oh wait, I want to add something to the agenda, they need to either do that before the meeting starts, and hopefully the agenda will have gone out before the meeting so that people have a chance. They can say to the chair, oh, can we put this on the agenda? I want to discuss this. And the chair can then, at the very beginning of the meeting, say, we've had these requests to add these items. Is there an objection to adding them to the agenda? If not, we'll add them to the agenda and then adopt the agenda. If a member has something that's just come up in the 5 minutes that the meeting has started, I hope not, but sometimes it happens. If a member has had something come up, they can say before the agenda is adopted, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, Madam President, I'd like to add something to the agenda. That's the time to do it, because once the agenda is adopted, it shouldn't be deviated from. And if somebody wants to add something to it, they need to move to amend the agenda. And that's complicated. Really, unless it is just a super urgent thing that just cannot wait until the end of the meeting, any other things that might need to be taken up that were not on the agenda should then be added at the end of the meeting after all other agenda items have been disposed of. You'll also find more and more bodies will use a consent agenda. This is a subset of the agenda. Usually it's an item that's either the first or sometimes the last item on an agenda. The purpose of it is for items that don't really require a discussion. They're usually pro forma items. They're usually items that, you know, it's already clear that most members, all members agree and that there's not going to be any debate or controversy about it. They can be put on the consent agenda and voted on en banc without any formal discussion. All it takes is one member to say, hey, I think we need to discuss this. I object to this being on the consent agenda, to pull an item out of that consent agenda and put it on the main agenda for discussion. And if somebody requests that and says, hey, I'd like to take this out of the consent agenda, the chair should remove it from the consent agenda and put it on the main agenda for discussion. But this is a tool. The consent agenda is a tool that allows a deliberative body to streamline its business, especially if that business is something that the body is used to recurring regularly and something that doesn't need to have a full discussion. It is not a means by which the officers of an organization can try to sneak things past the body and get them to approve it without discussion. If officers are doing that, you're abusing the rules, and any of your members would be right to call you out on it. So somebody's asking a question here. Um, so somebody's asked on a previous thing, if a person has a question about a report, is the question kept until all reports are given and asked during unfinished business, or can it be asked when a report is given? We'll talk about the discussion phase in a moment, but it can be up to the discretion of the chair or the body whether it dispenses with questions and with motions made during committee reports, or does a committee simply report out and then it gets put on for unfinished business? It can go either way. It's really up to the tradition of that body, honestly. And then Lane has asked, is adding an agenda item still fine to do for agencies that have to publish their agendas 24 hours in advance, like a state agency? That's a very good point. Agencies and organizations that are bound by the Freedom of Information Act, I think under those circumstances, cannot change their agendas after notice has been given. And so if there's some urgent matter or some urgent issue, I'm not really sure how they dispose of that, because that's in the Freedom of Information Act. That's a matter of state law. So you have to ask a lawyer. But I would think that it just simply can't be done, that a special emergency meeting would have to be called to discuss that item later, so that due notice can be given. So that's an agenda. An agenda will generally incorporate the standard orders of business, but it may include other items and other things depending on what the tradition of that body is. So how does a meeting end? We've completed our order of business. We've dispensed with everything on the agenda. And really there's only nothing left to do but adjourn. So, you know, the meeting is ended. That's what adjourning means. The meeting is ended until its next scheduled meeting. You know, if all business has been completed, then a motion to adjourn from a member is not necessary. The chair can simply ask. So generally, once the agenda has been completed, the chair can ask, is there any further business? Hearing none, without objection, the committee is adjourned. But if the chair is a stickler like me and likes to have votes on things, the chair can simply say, there being no further business, the question is that the board do now adjourn. It can go either way. You know, the without objection phrase can sometimes be used in circumstances like that to streamline, but you do need to actually give members at least a couple of seconds to raise an objection. So you don't speed through it. But because somebody may be trying to unmute their microphone to say, hey, wait a minute, give them a second. But if not, then the chair can simply declare the meeting adjourned once the agenda is complete. Other things that a board or a committee or a body might do is take a recess, which is a formal break for a set amount of time. Usually this will be built into the agenda, and so if it's built into the agenda, there doesn't need to be a motion. The chair can simply declare that that's the item on the agenda and take a recess. You know, or it may be that we have kind of gotten taken too long on a certain item in the meeting, and now it's lunchtime and people are hungry, and a member may say, I move that we take that 30-minute recess now so that we can get lunch, and we'll continue on the agenda after our 30-minute recess. And then the body will vote on that as a regular motion. But sometimes a small thing may come up, a glitch may come up, in which the officers of the board may get a question they don't know quite how to handle, and they need a few minutes to figure it out. And so they may say, okay, the committee or the board will stand at ease while we figure this out, and we'll get right back to it. It's just going to take a couple minutes. We're not adjourned. We're not in a recess. We're just not going to do anything for a few minutes. This is called standing at ease. And a chair can declare and revoke that as they need to, but it shouldn't last for very long. It really is just a technical thing. Somebody's asking me about tips for virtual meetings, and I promise you we will cover that. So that's sort of the general process for a meeting. So then comes the juicy thing that everybody wants to know. How are motions supposed to be done? And what the heck are all these different kinds of motions anyway? So a motion is, by its definition, a formal proposal that the body takes some action. And it's the, you know, if you just think of the body as itself an individual. If I am my own person, I am an individual, and I am a body, which I hope I am, in my mind, I have a thought process. I'm going to do something. Should I do it? Should I not do it? Okay, I'm going to do it. A deliberative body consisting of many individuals has to undertake that same process. But it's much more formal because there are many different voices going on. And hopefully you don't have many different voices in your head. Although if you do, I respect you very much for managing that. And so a deliberative body needs to have a motion in order to have a discussion on that proposal. There's really no sense in having a discussion on something that that doesn't lead to an action being taken. And so there are different kinds of motions, but the most important kind is what's called the main motion. And the main motion is one that introduces a new item of business to a body. It's the kind of substantive decision that the body exists to make. All other motions exist to either aid in the disposal of the main motion or to aid in the process of the body itself. And so subsidiary motions are those motions that affect or modify the main motion. This is like amending or sending to a committee or other things that we'll talk about. Privileged motions are those that don't affect the main motion, but have to do with the operations of the body itself. So maybe there's been a breach of order, or there has been somebody else is talking in the background too loud and we need to get them to shut up before we can continue. Maybe there's something else going on, like it's too hot, or the building is on fire, perhaps. Privileged motions help the body quickly handle those things and get back to their normal order when it's safe to do so. And then incidental motions are specific maneuvers that don't fit into those categories, but only arise in certain circumstances. And usually that's a breach of order or something else like that. So here's the deal about motions, and this is what I experience in some deliberative bodies, is that people will let the motions fly. You know, they'll try to, it's like spray and pray shotgun approach to motions, where, you know, people are just trying to get what they want out into the body as quickly as they can, and that's not really the way it should be done. And it's important for the chair to manage it and make sure that only one person is talking at a time. And the person who gets the chair's attention first is the one who gets to make a motion. But a motion should be made with very precise and exact wording. And if you're going to make a motion, you need to say it slowly so that the chair and the secretary can hear you and record it. And if it's going to be a long one, write it down first and send it to them so that they can have it ready. And a chair and a secretary may ask, if you start to get wordy, ask you to write it down and give it to them. And that may be something that requires the body to take a quick break while that happens. But you really need to be very precise about these motions. It is a point of aggravation for me, and I'm sure it is for many people, when somebody makes a motion and they kind of go off into the air, and, you know, they're like something like da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. That's not a good motion. You, making a motion, should not expect the president or the secretary to fill in the blanks for you, and really you don't want them to. They might fill in the blanks for something that you don't want. So if you're going to make motions, you want to be very precise in the wording. So the process for doing this, and this is very important, when nobody else is speaking, and chairs and presiding officers, you want to be able to give opportunity. You don't want to rush through things so fast that no one has the opportunity to get your attention to make a motion. You want to allow a little bit of air and a little bit of space for this. But when nobody else is speaking, get the chair's attention by simply saying, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, Madam President, and wait for them to recognize you. This is important. Don't be like, I want to make a motion to da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. That's rude. Don't do that. But simply say, Mr. President, Madam President, and wait for them to say, Mr. Bullock, how can we help you? And then say, and then don't launch into a speech. This is where people like to launch into a speech. And then the chair would be very justified in saying, what's your point? Get to the motion. You can have your discussion after you make the motion. Motion comes first, discussion comes next. And so you want to then make your motion and don't start explaining it yet. And then the chair will ask for a second. Now, why do we require a second on many motions? Because the body has a right not to have its time taken up by something only one person wants. There needs to at least be two of you. And so the chair will ask if there's a second person who wants to make this motion. And so if there's the chair will ask, the chair will state the motion, restate it to make sure they got it right, and they'll ask if there's a second. And if there's a second, then the chair will state the question again, and it's formally under consideration and a discussion can begin. If there's no second, and sometimes there will be this awkward pause in which people kind of look at each other and be like, are you gonna do it? Are you gonna do it? And maybe somebody said, fine, I'll second it. But if there's no second, then that means literally no one else in the meeting wants to talk about this and you're the only one and maybe you just need to give up on this. And be okay with that. It's rare. I've never seen a motion fail for want of a second before. Usually somebody will say, okay, I will second this because I want to see what happens. But it's not until the motion has been seconded, if it requires a second, and most motions do, that a discussion on the motion can begin. And so once the question is under consideration, the chair will then, and the Robert's Rules of Order calls this debate. I don't like to call it debate. I like to call it discussion because debate has negative connotations that in our modern day we don't really like. But it should be a discussion. And so the chair will generally invite the person who made the motion to speak first. Don't take too long. The body does not have all day. And we'll talk about time limits in these things in a moment. But then the chair will invite anybody else to speak after you're done. And this can be a good time to take questions. You may give your spiel and then say, okay, I'm open for any questions. And the chair will then ask if anybody has any questions for you. And you can handle that question and answer back and forth politely. And the chair can intervene if necessary. But then you're done. And then the chair will ask if anybody else wants to speak. If there's like a queue of people, you know, some people are against, some people are for, then the chair should alternate between those people. But I would say in most situations, you're not going to get anyone who's particularly passionate because people aren't going to really make very controversial motions. And so, you know, generally it's going to, a lot of the back and forth will happen with the original mover of the motion. There'll be question and answer and back and forth, and then people generally will be satisfied with this. I will just say that if the mover who has the floor is receiving questions, you should ask a question. Don't say you want to ask a question and then make a speech. Wait until it's your turn to make a speech. Sometimes I hear about that where, like, you know, I want to ask you a question, but I'm going to launch into this long explanation first. Don't do that. Just ask your question and let them answer it. And eventually, you know, the chair will come to this determination that, okay, all that's been said is what's needed to be said. The chair will ask, are you ready for the question? Are you ready to vote? And if nobody says, hey, I'm not ready, then they'll move on. One of my giant pet peeves during debate or during discussion is when you get this one member who's not really paying attention, is kind of bored and frustrated and playing with their hair and getting fussy, and they'll just say, I moved the previous question. I don't want to talk anymore. I don't want to debate. I moved the previous question. Let's just get this over with. That's rude. Don't do that. That's just very rude. And it is an example of one member trying to co-opt the business of the whole body. And a chair would be right to call you out and say, no, you're out of order. You know, if there needs to be a full debate, there needs to be a full debate, and we're going to have a full debate on it. We're not going to try to shut down debate. There may be circumstances where it's necessary to shut down debate, but that's a determination for the chair to make. So we've exhausted the discussion. And we're ready to vote. And so the chair will restate the question, and they will say, the question is that the board of da-de-da-de-da, whatever it is. As many as of that opinion say aye, give a little space, because you want to give people the opportunity to unmute themselves, and then say, of the contrary, no. Give a minute. Don't assume that nobody's going to say no. Just give it at least a second and a half. And then the chair will render their opinion about the results. And there are different formulations of this phrasing. You know, you can just say all in favor, say aye, all opposed, say no. People have their own ways of doing it. That's not as important, as long as you give people the opportunity to say aye and no. But then the chair will render their opinion. And this is where I think if you're a chair, it's good to start this as a question. Say, I think the ayes have it. Because then if people start screaming and shouting at you, then you're wrong. And you may want to do a roll call vote or some other determination in order to get a better gauge of it. But I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. You want to give just a little extra space just in case somebody forgot to unmute and they weren't heard. It's just one of those things. And then you move on to the next item. No need to rehash it. No need to continue discussion on it. Once a vote is taken, a vote is taken. So some rules for that debate process. Your own bylaws, your own meeting rules may have different rules, and that's okay. A board or a committee or a body can adopt special rules that take precedence over Robert's rules. What's important is that if you don't have anything that says this, then you should follow what Robert's rule says. If there's no time limit set on debate, then the general rule is that each person can speak for up to 10 minutes at a time and may speak twice on a given question. You can't reserve your time. You can't speak 5 minutes at one point and then speak 15 minutes later. You get 10 minutes, and if you don't take them, you lose them. This is not Congress, okay? This is how it goes. Again, bodies may have their own rules. The chair should give preferences in who gets to talk. The chair should prefer the person who made the motion just the first time, immediately after the question has been stated, so that they get the opportunity to explain why they're making that motion. And then the chair should prefer those who have not spoken over those who already have. So if you, if the speaker or the mover of the motion has spoken, and then somebody who didn't like that idea has spoken, then if it's between the speaker speaking again, the maker of the motion speaking again, and somebody who hasn't spoken yet, the chair should prefer the person who hasn't spoken yet. And then if necessary, the chair should alternate between those in favor and those against. It's not always necessary. Usually it's not so cut and dried as all that. But if it does get to it, then the chair should alternate. And then a general rule is about germaneness. We need to stay on topic. We need to not talk about other things. We need to stay on what this question is about. And a chair would be right to call out anybody who drifts off of topic. They can say, order, please stay on topic, or just simply say, please get on with what you're talking about. It's important to discuss issues and not personalities. People can get very passionate, they can get mad, they can start to attack each other personally rather than talking about the issues. And this is why Robert's Rules prefers a formality of language that a lot of people find uncomfortable or stilted or too formal. The purpose of this formality of language is to keep people from attacking each other. It is to keep people focused on issues and not on personalities. And that's why it's important, generally, you should always address the chair, not other members. So if somebody says, they give their little statement and you have a question and they say, I'm opening for questions, and you have a question, you would say, Madam Chairperson, I wonder if the person making the speech goes da-di-da-di-da, and you ask your question in that form. Don't address that person directly. Now, it's up to the chair how much they want to enforce this. And I would always say, use the level of informality that is productive. But if people start to get rude, enforce the rules and make people address the chair and not each other. That helps cut down on tempers and passions. Somebody's asked the question here. I just note that if it comes to voting via a conference call or Zoom, what constitutes, does everybody have to speak? The chair should give room for people to speak, but not require everybody to speak. And I'm realizing that we have gone on for an hour and time has flown by. So I'm going to try to get through the rest of this as much as I can. We're nearly done. So there are two things about what's debatable and what's not debatable. First and foremost, any main motion and some secondary motions are debatable, as long as they're the kind of secondary motions that don't delay, extend, or cut short debate. And here's the reason why. Those motions that limit, extend, postpone a debate are not debatable, because if you start debating about the debate, you could be debating forever. And so we have to kind of extend the limit somewhere. There's a table of motions in the back of Robert's Rules that many chairs will use as a cheat sheet to determine whether something is debatable or not. I recommend following that. Generally, motions that restrict people's right to speak by cutting short debate require a 2/3 vote. And that's because we want to make sure that an overwhelming majority of the body is in favor of cutting short the debate. We don't want to cut off a minority unless it's a very small minority. Process of amending. An amendment, of course, is changing the current questions, and this is where parliamentary tangles can happen. The process of amending, if it's substantive, if it radically changes the nature of the proposal, then it does warrant discussion. If it's really technical and it's just helping clear up ambiguity, maybe you just want to just sideline the person making and ask them if they would be willing to accept a certain change. But if it's substantive, if there's a long resolution, you may want, you need to reduce that amendment to writing, represent removing language with a strike through, represent adding in new language with an underline. Again, amendments should not violate the principles of germaneness, should not bring up things that are not related to the matter at hand, and they should not violate the principle of settledness. That means that an amendment should not try to bring up something that has already been decided by the body, and a chair is right to rule out of order an amendment that attempts to do that. You can amend an amendment, but you cannot amend an amendment. So I generally say just try to avoid amending amendments because it can get confusing at that point. Handle one amendment at a time and work on that. This is an example from a recent resolution my own board adopted where we amended our bylaws and use striking and underlining to make those changes. So postponing or referring a question, these are an important way to dispense with business. If a discussion just gets really long and you're running out of time, you can, the chair can ask, the chair probably should ask, if there's a motion to carry over or table it. We used to call it table, we used to call it carryover. The recent editions of Robert's Rules call it a motion to postpone. I generally, if I'm chairing a meeting and I recommend to chairs, don't allow a motion to postpone indefinitely or table indefinitely. They're rude. It can, and they tend to get used and abused in a mean-spirited fashion. So, generally, if the body is committed to discussing something, it's generally rude to just dispose of it without actually voting on it. Vote it up or down. Don't disgrace it by tabling it indefinitely. But if it's clear that a question needs more research than the body can handle en masse, then maybe it needs to be referred to a standing committee, which has jurisdiction over that certain matter, or if there isn't a standing committee that has jurisdiction, then a special committee can be created just to handle that one question. And I'll just note that when that committee reports it back out at the next meeting, those reports don't require a second to adopt, because the committee is more than 2 people, right? And we don't want, if more than 2 people say that the body should consider something, then you don't need a third or fourth. It's already got its second if it's coming from a committee. So a body can change its mind if necessary. Generally, it shouldn't reverse itself, but there are certain circumstances where it may need to do so. That's what the motion to reconsider is for. It can bring back up something that's already been decided. You can also move to rescind a decision if you just want to get rid of it entirely without, going through it or voting on it again. Or you can vote to amend something previously adopted. All of these do the same thing. They bring business back up before the body, which has already been disposed. These require a 2/3 majority to succeed, and the person moving it has to have voted on the prevailing side when the matter was last discussed. Now, if you do everything by voice votes, then it's an honor system, because you can't necessarily record who said aye and who said no. So it's an honor system. So if somebody says, well, I'm going to move to reconsider, but people remember, hey, you voted against it, don't let them get away with it. So some tips for chairs and secretaries: read rules of order in brief. It is your friend. Demand exact wording. If people making motions get wordy, make them write it down. Don't let the body consider it until they've written it down. And if it gets overly complex, consider asking to refer it to a committee so that they can come back with a recommendation. Restate the question multiple times so that people have ample opportunity to hear it. And if somebody says, I'm sorry, I don't know what the question is, restate it again. You always want to balance informality with clarity. And always, always, always take a vote. Don't operate on consensus. It aggravates me. As somebody who takes minutes for many different bodies, it irritates me to no end. When the chair says, okay, I think we all agree, moving on. No, we don't all agree. We didn't take a vote. I don't know that we all agreed. And is somebody making the minutes? How do I know? No vote, no decision. Require that they vote, even if it's going to be unanimous. And if you're the secretary and you have a doubt about anything, immediately ask for a clarification. Because what you don't want to have happen is that you have to make it up and it be wrong and people get mad about it. So virtual meetings, chairs and presiding officers should be extra careful about virtual meetings because connectivity issues can be very problematic. People may be trying to speak and you can't hear them. So don't be afraid to take time. If you see that a member is not on the camera or you see that you haven't heard from them, just check in and make sure and ask at multiple points, has everybody said what they want to say? Don't try to go too fast and rush through the business because there may be somebody who's trying to talk who hasn't had the chance to. It is very important that members have to be able to speak and hear in real time. If that's not possible, then the meeting should be adjourned until that can be solved, that problem can be solved. If it's only a handful of people who are able to speak and hear and other people are locked out for whatever reason, you can't have a good meeting that way. I would prefer using a video conference service like Zoom, so that way people can be on camera and see each other. That way if somebody's like trying to get your attention, they're all up in the camera like this because they can't be heard, you can see that and you can say, hey, Ben, I see you waving your arms madly. Do you have something you want to say? Use screen sharing to display the agenda. And if somebody gets a complicated motion, just open up a Word document, throw it on there and start typing. Because the worst thing that can happen is people not know what it is that they're voting on. And above all, be gracious and be patient. Virtual meetings are a pain in the butt, but they can be very powerful tools if used correctly. Zoom, by the way, has some limited voting functionality. If you happen to be able to pull up your participant list, you can see a yes and a no icon there. And you can select that. And you can ask people to give their votes yes or no that way if you need to take a recorded vote. You want to be careful in case you've got people on the meeting who shouldn't be voting. But it can be a good tool for you to use. You can use the chat box. People can type in their questions in the chat box or type in their motions in the chat box. So a conference service like Zoom can be very powerful if used correctly. But above all, don't rush. Don't rush through the meeting. So that's what I've got, and I do apologize for going over. I get excitable in these things, and sometimes I don't judge the time well. I thank you all for being patient and staying and hearing me out on this. The rules of order is something I'm really passionate about, and so I'm willing to stay on any longer. If anyone has any questions, but if you need to drop off, know that we've recorded this and we'll post the recording later. So I'm going to start going back through the chat box here. Let's see. When it comes to voting.
Thank you so much for everything. It was very informative, and I really enjoyed it a lot. I think there's probably some questions coming in now. But I wanted to make an announcement. If you did not see it on the chat, Junior League members, the Education Development and Community Board Bank is providing a copy of the In Brief book to you as your surcy for attending today. We'll be sending an email out on how you can pick that up. And I'll let Ben answer any questions that you might have.
And
once you get that copy, read it.
I just wanted to pop in and say we will be getting the attendee list, I believe, from Ben. So if you're a Junior League member, just make sure your name's reflected, as we would be able to find it, because we're going to have to cross-reference with Digital Cheetah to make sure we capture everybody. So just make sure if your name's different here, you're signed in differently than we would normally be able to find you, shoot one of us a message so we are sure we don't miss you.
And if you don't hear from us with a follow-up email, I'll send out a follow-up email as well. And if you don't get it for whatever reason, and like next week you're like, I never heard back from Ben, email me directly and I'll gladly share with you the recording, but we'll post it on the Together SC website as well. So somebody asked me what the difference between Roberts and then Mason's rules and Jefferson's rules of order. These are all different rules of order. Roberts is probably the most popular one, the most well-known one. But there are other rules. It depends on what your bylaws say. Many bylaws will just simply say, we're incorporating Robert's rules of order as our rules of order, and that's it. There's not that much difference in my experience, just because over the last 100 years they kind of blended together. But Masons, either Masons or Jefferson's is what the House of Representatives uses. It might be a little bit much for a committee. So somebody's asked, what is the role of an executive director during a meeting? if you're the executive director, your role, if you're looking at Robert's Rules of Order, you might want to look up the section on executive secretary, because that's what in old school societies, the role of the executive director grew out of that role of executive secretary. And many executive directors are designated as the secretaries of their board for this reason. You're a staff member. You're not a voting member of the board. Your job is to give advice. Your job is to consult with the board and make sure that the board is adequately informed about what's going on in the organization so that they can make good decisions that impact the organization and your work. You know, there's so much documentation written about board governance that I would hesitate to speak too much on it here. But Together SC has a lot of resources about you know, the relationship between chief staff member and the board. So I would point you to those. But during a board meeting, an executive director should defer to the board members and be ready to give advice when asked and be ready to offer if necessary. Okay, other questions? I'm just scanning here just to make sure. Somebody asked of a concrete example of what an at-ease break might be. Usually I see them as just sort of a, somebody has asked a complicated parliamentary question and we need to go look it up in the big book. So give us a few minutes to go do that while and just take a quick break while we look that up and come back at you with an answer. That's usually why a body would stand at ease. Or if there is if it's a big assembly and there was a ballot taken, the assembly might take a break while the ballots are being counted. Let's see. Somebody's asked, you know, with virtual meetings, how can we tell who has raised their hand first? A chair may want to pay very close attention. If the chair wants to use the hand-raising function, the formal hand-raising function in something like Zoom, commit to it and ask people to, you know, use that hand-raising function so that, and then just pay attention, you know, and make sure that everybody who has their hands raised eventually gets called on. The worst thing you can do is ignore an individual member who's been trying to speak. But, you know, it's up to the chair's discretion who gets to speak first. If two people raise their hand at the same time, you know, maybe as the chair you want to pick somebody who hasn't talked a whole bunch over somebody who talks all the time. Let's see. I think we've caught all of the questions. But if anybody has any questions that come up afterwards, just let me know. You know, my email is on the Together SC website. You know, looking up things in the big book is something I enjoy doing, and so I'm glad to help you figure that out if you ever have any problems. So with that, I am going to, if there's no further business, I will declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a lovely day.